I'm an assistant hospital administrator in a large hospital in the Northeast. US. I am also a retired Air Force colonel who spent almost 25 years working as a medical service officer. I have had tours of duty all over the world. I met my wife Kay while serving at what used to be called the Wilford Hall, United States Air Force Medical Center at LA Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Kay worked for the Bexar County Sheriff's Department as a civilian in their main offices at the time. I was a first lieutenant and was working in management in one of the departments at the hospital. I am not a medical doctor. Kay and I met one day when I was visiting a friend that also worked for the sheriff. And when I saw Kay, I knew I was in love. Fast forward 3 months and Kay and I are dating. About a year later, I was promoted to captain and took over running the department I was assigned to. This was also the year I asked Kay to marry me and she agreed. About 2 weeks later, Kay and I traveled up to Missouri to visit my parents so they could meet their future daughter-in-law. My mother instantly developed what I could only describe as hatred for Kay. My mother really let me have it while we went out for a walk. Later, my father later told me that my mother was not wanting another woman in my life. I am the oldest of 4 kids and the other 3 are girls. So I dismissed my mother's concerns and Kay and I got married at the base tail. Then about 6 months later, Kay informed me that she was pregnant. I was excited to be a dad. Then not long after this happened, I received orders to Okinawa. My oldest daughter was born in Okinawa. About a year after this, Kay's father passed away and she took the baby and returned to Texas. Her hometown is Waco. I was not able to join her because of pressing issues. Then about a week later, I received a letter from Kay saying she was not returning. Her mother needed her. I understood this. So I moved into a smaller place and finished my tour. My next duty station was Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. By this time, Kay had joined me. All seemed well while at Maxwell Air Force Base. Kay got pregnant with my second daughter. I spent almost 3.5 years at Maxwell Air Force Base. It was in our last year there that I started to notice Kay was starting to get distant. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and Kate would be sleeping on the couch. By the time I got ordered to Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, our bedroom was dead. I was getting packed one day when Kay told me that she was not coming to Virginia and that she wanted us to separate. She wanted to move back to San Antonio and go back to work for the Bexar County Sheriff. I really had no other choice. I agreed and went east and Kay went back to Texas while in Virginia. I was promoted to major and was in effect running one of the departments at the hospital. I also knew I had lost Kay. I was not under any false beliefs. I could save my marriage. So I called Kate and told her I was going to file for a divorce. She started crying and said no. She would be in Virginia as soon as she could work out a notice. She drove from Texas to Virginia with the girls and their clothes. Of course, I was happy to see my girls that day. They arrived. I think I was the happiest man in Virginia. Over the next few months, I spent a lot of time showing my girls the area. Kay found a job working for one of the local police departments and all was good. Even the bedroom was back to normal. At least for a while. Kate normally got home before I did. Then one day I was not feeling well. And the colonel let me go home. I got the mail and seen our cell phone bill. I opened it and noticed a lot of calls to San Antonio in it. I never counted them, but there were at least 4 calls a week all to the same number. I placed a bill in my car and spent some time thinking about that phone number. So I used the trick to disable caller ID and dial that number. A man answered the call. I quickly said wrong number and hung up. About this time, Kate came home from work. She asked me if I had fetched the mail and I said, I had. She said the phone bill was due. I said I had not seen it. The next day I was back at the hospital and I got to thinking about the fact that Kay had worked for the sheriff. It was really beginning to bother me about who that man was. So after a lot of thought, I decided to attempt the ruse. I called that number and pretended to be a police equipment salesman. The man said the department he worked for got their supplies with another company. I asked him what his name was and he said, Hank. I then asked him if he would give me his email so I could add him to my list of police officers I send a magazine to every 3 months. He said no. And we hung up. Several days later, I noticed Kay was bothered by the fact our phone bill had not arrived. I knew something was not right and stopped playing detective. One of the sergeants in my department had just recently been divorced. I asked him to come to my office. He came in and I asked him to tell me his story. He told me one of the chaplains gave him the phone number of a guy that is a go-to person for any information needed. When it came to a cheating wife, that afternoon, I called that man and we spoke for several minutes. I told him my story and he suggested a private investigator. He told me what the private investigator charged. It was not cheap. But this man said, if it can be found, he will do it. So I contacted him for one purpose, to find out who the man was at that number. All I could tell him was he was a cop in Bexar County, Texas, and his name was Hank. Several days later, I had his full name and where he worked as well as his address. That private investigator did good work. Kay finally went by Verizon and paid the bill in person. I am not sure, but I think she knew. I knew about those calls. So the gaslighting began. I started to be told about a friend in Texas who was sick. Kay was good at that. So good that if I didn't already know better, I would have believed her. Then several months later, Kay said she wanted to take the girls and go back to San Antonio. I was against it. Still Kay went. I called a good friend who was a civilian employee at Wilford Hall in San Antonio about Kay. He said he would keep an eye out for her. I gave him Hank's address. About a week later, he sent me several photos of Kay with Hank in his house. I knew then this is where Kay was living. I asked for and received 10 days of leave. I was on the next flight out of Norfolk headed to San Antonio. I also had that man who gave me the private investigator's information with me. It's a long story, but he wanted me to come meet some other men and come join them in a group session with a great lady who is a therapist after showing this man the photos of Kate and Hank. He said, let's go. He and I arrived in San Antonio and got rooms about a mile from where Hank lived the morning. We pulled into that driveway. I seen Kay's car next to Hank's vehicle. The man who was with me was the one to knock on the door. Remember, Hank is a deputy sheriff and this is Texas. It was Kay that answered the door. And once she got to the door and saw me, she started crying and slammed the door. This man and I almost came to blows as he forcefully pushed me back to the car. About this time, Hank walked out of his house with a firearm in his hand. We finally got in the rental car and back to the hotel. Several hours later, Kate called me. She was wanting to speak to me and was asking who that man was. I said it was not important. What was important is you are cheating on me and have been doing so for a long time. I want a divorce and will be filing once I get back to Virginia. Kay begged me to tell her where I was. Said Hank was a mistake and if I would give her another chance, she promised to fix this. I just shut my phone off because of the tickets. We had to wait several days to return to Norfolk. Funny, when I got home, Kay was there. The man was going to drop me off but told me to stay away from Kay. He let me stay with him and get my bearings. I later learned that all it took was 6 months in Virginia as a service person to be considered a resident for a divorce. So I filed for divorce. I had photos of Kay with Hank. Kay attempted to say we should do this in Texas, but the judge correctly quoted Virginia law. The judge also listened to my story and the man that was with me also testified to what he saw that day. Kay was fighting the divorce and was begging me to hold off and agree to marriage counseling for the girls' sake. It took 2 hearings and a lot of meetings. But Kay and I were divorced. Kay got the girls and was allowed to go back to Texas with him. However, by this time, Hank was scared of her and he refused to let her move in with him. So Kate came back to Virginia, where she still lives to this day. About 18 months after my divorce was final, I got orders to Edwards Air Force Base. I stayed there for almost 3 years. I was stationed in bases in Ohio, Florida and finally back to Texas where I retired as a colonel. About 5 years ago, I got a fantastic job in the Northeast U.S. where I am still living. My girls are now in their 20s. They are married and both have kids. Now, Kay never received any spousal support from me because we were not married a full 10 years. She is not entitled to any of my retirement and lost all her dear access. I did pay child support. I did remarry and live with my wife Judy in her old family home out in the country. My daughters over time started to understand it was their mother that caused a breakup. They forgave her for it. It was about a year ago when my oldest daughter and her husband came for a visit. She told me the whole story about Hank, who he was and why Kay broke up our marriage because of him. It's an old story. Hank was her high school boyfriend. He was also from Waco. What happened was Kay was not his first choice. He was not interested in Kate until after Kay and I got married. Then this other woman got married and moved away. Then he rekindled their romance. I never really stood a chance. As I understood the day Kay told her daughter about Hank, she walked out of the house and did not speak to her for several weeks today. Their relationship, as far as I know, is strained. I lost my mother to COVID in 2020. I never really understood why my mother took an instant dislike for Kay.